nothing about Ireland. Well, I guess I'm going to have to stop wasting so much money on video games. So I think it's fair to say that gaming can be quite an expensive pastime these days. Despite the fact that most new releases are now $70, many modern games also include DLC, season passes, and microtransactions. Not to mention that if you own a console, you will need to pay in order to be able to play online with your friends. This is where free games come in. Games that perhaps aren't the deepest or most complex, but that can offer a decent amount of enjoyment when you don't have any disposable income. I was shocked when I went down the rabbit hole of free horror video games and found some insanely well made and addictive games that somehow are playable free of charge. I would happily pay $5, maybe even $10 for many of the games I'm about to show you, and I highly recommend anyone even vaguely interested in horror games download these titles as soon as possible. There are literally hundreds of free horror games out there, which means that I will probably return to this topic again in future. Estigma is one of those games that is incredibly difficult to describe. On paper, it's an action puzzler where you play as this little worm thing, and your goal is to light every tile red in a stage. Sounds simple enough, but when you actually see the game in motion, it's kinda like... what the fuck? Jesus! Speaking of Jesus, why is Jesus here? It's a total mindfuck of a game that, while very simplistic from a gameplay standpoint, has stayed with me thanks to its trippy and disturbing visuals. Upon starting the game up, you're treated to a very short... You're treated to a very short cutscene featuring some disturbing imagery and text that simply says, "They watched me in my dreams." A brief hint at things to come. The game's first stage is a tutorial designed to teach you everything you need to know in order to play the game. As I mentioned earlier, Estigma is a fast-paced action puzzler where the goal is to light all tiles in a stage red. You light a tile red by simply moving across it. However, moving over a tile a second time will turn that tile dark red, which means you can no longer move across that tile. Thankfully, if you trap yourself, you can quickly restart the stage through the pause menu. Later on, you will also encounter explosive tiles that will detonate upon the player moving across them. The only way to safely bypass these explosive tiles is to first pick up a brain power-up that will allow you to survive a single hit. While all this sounds rather simplistic, what keeps things interesting are the delightfully weird and disturbing creatures you'll meet along your journey, who exist for no other reason than to fuck up your run. From creepy doll heads to whatever the fuck this thing is, there is a surprisingly varied collection of enemies in this game, and they all force you to mix up your tactics. For example, these creatures spit eyeballs at you that will kill you instantly if they make contact, which forces you to keep moving. But on the other end of the spectrum, these Jesus things cannot hurt you, but instead will obscure your view, which makes navigating the map significantly more challenging. You also only have a limited amount of time to complete the stage before the timer runs out and you are forced to replay the entire stage from the beginning. This forces you to think on your feet, adding to the intense nature of the game. Every few stages you'll have to take on a boss of some kind. These encounters are incredibly intense, with the boss usually chasing the player through the stage. There is no room for error in these boss levels. One wrong move and you are dead. These stages can also be quite scary at times, which is not something I expected to say about a game with a 16-bit visual style. I also can't talk about this game and not mention its incredible soundtrack. There aren't a huge amount of tracks in the game, but what is here is incredibly catchy and really adds to the fast-paced nature of the game. I don't think there is much more I can say about Estigma without spoiling some late game content, which is something I'd rather not do, as the fucked up visuals are kind of the main attraction when it comes to a game like this. Also, I would get hella demonetized if I did show content from the late game. While Estigma is a very enjoyable action puzzler for the most part, I wouldn't go in expecting a large amount of content. I finished the entire game in just over half an hour, and I didn't really feel like there was much reason for me to continue playing once I had rolled credits. But if all you are looking for is a quick and fun puzzler to while away a few minutes with, Estigma comes highly recommended. I wasn't expecting much when I first downloaded Mr. Hopp's Playhouse. Its gameplay seemed very basic and repetitive, and its visuals looked uninspired. But surprisingly, this might be my favourite game on the list. Mr. Hopp's Playhouse is a short but fun 2D survival horror game that is far scarier than it has any right to be. In Mr. Hopp's Playhouse, you play as Ruby, a young girl who is terrified of her toy rabbit, the titular Mr. Hopp. He actually looks like my toy rabbit, but at least my rabbit doesn't plan to murder me every night. Isn't that right, Robbie? One night Ruby notices her rabbit seemingly disappear into thin air, so she decides to run to her mom and dad for help. This is where control is handed over to the player. Thankfully though, you are not thrown straight in at the deep end. Instead, you are given a quick tutorial explaining the game's various mechanics. Ruby can run, jump, and crouch to take cover behind objects. She also has a pathetic stamina gauge that only allows her to run for approximately 3 seconds. Once you have gotten the hang of the controls, it's time for Ruby to make her way over to her parents' room. However, upon reaching the room, Ruby discovers that her parents are missing, and so sets out to find them. However, on the way back to her room, Ruby notices something. From here on out, Ruby will need to be careful while exploring her house, so as to not attract the attention of Mr. Hopp. The gameplay is admittedly rather simplistic in Mr. Hopp's Playhouse. It is essentially a 2D survival horror game, where Ruby needs to sneak around her house, avoiding Mr. Hopp whenever possible. Mr. Hopp is almost always patrolling around in the background. If Ruby accidentally steps on a toy or makes too much noise, Mr. Hopp will quickly come to investigate, and if he manages to catch you, it's lights out. It can actually be surprisingly intense, jumping over toys and quickly moving from cover to cover before the rabbit spots you. Even though the gameplay is incredibly basic, Mr. Hopp's Playhouse still manages to frequently mix things up by including the occasional puzzle, or by having Mr. Hopp become more aggressive and deranged looking the further you make it through the game. It's legitimately terrifying getting caught by this guy, especially if you suffer from epilepsy.
Battling seizure robots.
The game also has some fucked jump scares, the majority of which I won't spoil here, but the first time I encountered this thing, my soul nearly left its body. Again, just like Estigma, Mr. Hopp's Playhouse is not a long game, but you really shouldn't expect that anyways when the experience is free. I completed my first playthrough in roughly 25 minutes, but there are multiple endings to unlock, which will significantly increase the game's replay value. Overall, I loved Mr. Hopp's Playhouse. Yes, its gameplay can be simplistic and slightly repetitive, but it's also a legitimately scary experience that managed to startle me more times than I'd like to admit. If you have got a half hour to kill, this is probably my number one pick on this list to download. If you are looking for a free horror game that has a substantial amount of content and replay value, look no further than Empty Shell Prologue, a survival horror roguelike that has hours of content to enjoy if you click with it. The premise of Empty Shell Prologue is simple but intriguing. You play as a volunteer who is sent to a secret facility on a remote Japanese island to investigate what happened to the people stationed there. For some unknown reason, every volunteer is sent to the island one person at a time, and with very few supplies. That is basically all the story you were given at the beginning, but you will be able to find more documents in-game that expand on the lore of this world, and many of these are very interesting and even creepy to read. If you've ever played a roguelike before, then you'll probably already know what to expect from Empty Shell's gameplay. Every new run begins with you stationed just outside the facility. The facility's level design will change every time you die, which means that this free game has potentially limitless replay value. Once inside the facility, you will have to complete a variety of different tasks in order to complete your mission. These usually include simple tasks like flicking a switch in order to restore power to an area, or finding a door code to make more progress through the facility. As mentioned earlier, by exploring the facility thoroughly, you can find documents that fill you in on what happened at the facility, but you can also find different items or weapons that will aid you in your mission. And trust me, you will want to find these additional items, because like most roguelites, Empty Shell can be a punishingly difficult game. Enemies can finish you off in mere seconds if you are not careful. That said, despite its difficult nature, combat is incredibly satisfying in this game. Your guns all feel powerful to use, and blowing away wave after wave of these guys never got old. If you have ever played a twin stick shooter like Hotline Miami, then you'll feel right at home here. Thankfully, you can also play with a controller if you don't wish to use a mouse and keyboard, which is what I ended up doing. Why did I choose to use a controller over keyboard and mouse? Motherfucker, does it look like I can afford a desk? I guess I should also briefly mention the game's very distinctive visual style. Basically, the whole game is played from the perspective of a CCTV surveillance camera. It's definitely an interesting idea, but unfortunately, this visual style can sometimes make it difficult to easily make out enemies or important items in your vicinity, although this issue was rare. Anyways, as someone currently under house arrest, it's nice to finally play a game that adequately conveys what it's like to be under surveillance 24 hours a day. Empty Shell Prologue might well be the best game on this list. It has an interesting premise, fun gameplay, and a shit ton of replay value. Unfortunately though, I've just never really been into the roguelike genre. I find most of them to be infuriatingly difficult and repetitive. That said, if you do enjoy this genre, I could easily see you absolutely adoring Empty Shell. Definitely worth a download either way. Okay, this one might be considered cheating since it's only a demo, but Conscript's demo gives you such a sizable chunk of the overall game that it felt like a worthy inclusion. There is well over an hour worth of content here, which makes it longer than Estigma and Mr. Hopp's Playhouse combined. I actually hope the developer puts that on the game's official box art. Conscript is a survival horror game set during World War I, which is a very unique setting for a horror game. To be honest, I didn't think the Great War would be an appropriate setting for a survival horror game, but after completing the demo, I came away impressed by the game's suffocating atmosphere and intense feeling of isolation. In Conscript, you play as a French soldier trying to survive during the Battle of Verdun. At the beginning of the game, the soldier is writing to his family back home and informs them that his brother was injured in battle but has since made a full recovery. However, shortly after he finishes writing his letter, the soldier finds his brother Pierre badly wounded. Despite his injuries, however, it appears Pierre will survive. That is until he suddenly goes missing and things start getting very strange. But I won't spoil any more story elements here. Conscript is a classic survival horror game through and through. We're talking resource management, limited inventory space, and manual saves. It's very obvious that developer Jordan Mochi was heavily inspired by the Resident Evil and Silent Hill series when designing this game, but thankfully he also gives players the freedom to customize the game to suit their playstyle. For example, if you find manual saving too restrictive, you can turn on checkpoints. There are also a wide range of difficulty settings that will cater to practically any skill level. Gameplay wise, you'll know what to expect if you've ever played a classic survival horror game before. You explore a semi-open environment, looking for keys and other items that will allow you to make progress through the game. Resource management is a must, since ammunition and healing supplies can be scarce at times. Combat is intense and anxiety inducing, and every now and then you might have to solve a simplistic puzzle in order to progress. The game is also fucking gorgeous, utilising a stunning pixel art style that is very visually pleasing. World War I has truly never looked this good. I also love the game's use of lighting, especially when you're in a bunker and can barely see 2 feet ahead of yourself, and then you suddenly hear this in the distance. The game can be surprisingly creepy, especially given its simplistic art style. The game also runs like a dream on practically any system, and I didn't have any frame rate issues at any point. Then why is this footage running at 30 FPS? Is what you're probably asking yourself right now. Motherfucker, does it look like I can afford 60 FPS? Unfortunately, one of my few issues with this game so far is that the few puzzles that are here in the demo are incredibly simplistic. For example, at one point you come across a door that is covered in wire. You later come across a pair of wire cutters and use them on the door from earlier. That really is as complicated as things get in the demo, and I really hope the final game has some proper brain teasers. Aside from that, my only other real issue with the game so far is that ammunition is far too plentiful, or at least it was on the normal difficulty. I never felt like I had to conserve my ammunition, and was able to gun down practically every enemy with reckless abandon. Combat is actually very enjoyable, with several different weapons to toy around with. Guns feel meaty, and you really feel the power behind every shot fired. Since the game is set during World War I, the guns you find are fucking old, and as such, are slow and take an absolute age to reload. But I found this really added to the tension, and is actually a great fit for a survival horror game. I just hope in the final game that I feel the need to occasionally conserve my ammunition. Overall, Conscript is looking very, very promising. The story is interesting, the setting works surprisingly well for a survival horror game, the visuals are absolutely stunning, and the gameplay is engaging and very true to survival horror games of old. I can't wait for the final release, and I highly recommend everyone check out the demo. Easily the shortest and most mechanically simplistic game on this list, My Friend is a Raven is still worth downloading for one simple reason. Its absolutely stunning hand-drawn art style. I have played very few games with such an eye-catching art style, and even fewer that were free. In My Friend is a Raven, you play as a man, returning to his apartment in order to speak with a raven, who apparently has the answers to why the world lies in ruin. This game can easily be completed in less than 5 minutes without much effort. However, doing so will net you the game's worst ending. The game has 4 endings, and unlocking them all will require you to solve some pretty clever puzzles. At its heart, My Friend is a Raven is a point-and-click adventure game. You use the A and D keys to move your character either left or right, and you use your mouse or touchpad to highlight objects in the environment you want to interact with. You can pick up certain objects and use those objects with items littered around the environment. It's all very simplistic, and even if you are planning to go for the best ending, you are unlikely to get more than 20 minutes of playtime from this game. But it's still a super interesting and visually gorgeous game, and well worth your time playing. It's also developed by the guy who went on to develop Choo Choo Charles, which is kinda lame. Now everyone will know how cool I am. Wait, am I recording? No! Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion, or Spooky's House of Jump Scares as it used to be known, is a first-person survival horror game developed by Lag Studios and released for PC in July of 2015. In Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion, you play as a history enthusiast who decides to visit a seemingly abandoned mansion in the hopes of learning more about the building and its history. However, before long, you find yourself thrust into a living nightmare and must fight your way through 1,000 rooms filled with all kinds of ghouls and ghosts in order to make your escape. Considering how popular Spooky's Mansion is, I'm surprised by how little information I was actually able to find online about the game's history or development. But regardless, Spooky's Mansion is easily one of the most popular free games out there and has developed a strong cult following over the years. There have been fan-made mods, cartoons, and even a really catchy song written by the Living Tombstone that has been stuck looping in my head for the last few weeks. Similar to games like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, or Outlast, Spooky's Mansion is a first-person survival horror game that emphasizes running from your enemies instead of trying to face them head-on. Once you hit new game, you are immediately thrown into the mansion and are introduced to the game's titular character, Spooky.
Hello, I am Spooky. And this is my home. Can you, humble player, make it through 1,000 rooms? Can you find what lies at the end? Or is there even an end? Because I don't really know. Anyway, just go.
And with that very thought-provoking and heartwarming speech out of the way, you begin your quest to try and make it through Spooky's Mansion alive. Thankfully, the game doesn't throw you straight in at the deep end. In fact, for the first 60 or so rooms, you are completely safe from anything that could potentially kill you. The worst thing you have to worry about are these cardboard cutouts that will occasionally startle you. The funny thing about these cardboard cutouts is that they really highlight how pathetic jump scares actually are. An ice cream cone, a cartoon octopus, or a piece of bread aren't traditionally considered terrifying objects. Well, I mean, a piece of toast jumping out at someone with celiac disease would probably be the most fucking terrifying thing that person had ever experienced. But regardless, when these otherwise mundane objects suddenly appear, accompanied by a deafening horror sting, it will make you jump out of your skin every time. And if my footage and erratic mouse movements are anything to go by, these fucking things were still startling me all the way up to the end of the game. Just goes to show that with most jump scares in video games, it's not really the enemy itself that is making you jump. It's more the loud sudden noise that's responsible for getting a reaction out of you. Anyways, as I said earlier, the first few dozen rooms are very uneventful in Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion. Aside from the odd disturbing picture every now and then, there is practically nothing that will have you on the edge of your seat. It is also worth noting that you will be seeing these exact same rooms hundreds of times over during your playthrough, and this is one of my biggest complaints with this game. There simply isn't enough room variety to keep things interesting for the 6 or so hours it will take you to beat this game. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of cool environments you will get to visit during the campaign, but these make up a very small percentage of the overall game time. Roughly 80% of the time, you'll be traversing through these bland, repetitive environments over and over again, and it does get quite tiring by the end. There isn't even much in the way of puzzles in the game either. Occasionally, you will find these mazes that require you to move through doors in a certain order, but that really is about it. Thankfully, this is one of my only complaints I have about Spooky's Mansion, since practically everything else is stellar. At room 50, you will reach an elevator where you are given an opportunity to save your progress before descending down further into the mansion. In most save rooms, you can usually find a short note written by someone who was previously trapped in the mansion. These notes are usually worth seeking out, as they not only fill you in on the backstory of the mansion, but will sometimes also include little hints on how to deal with certain monster types. Some of these notes are also really good at filling you with anxiety about what you might encounter later on in the mansion. At around room 65, Spooky's Mansion finally takes the training wheels off, and actually throws something quite hostile and deadly at you. This is Specimen 2, otherwise known as Goo. If you are wondering what Specimen 1 was, well, yeah, there's your answer. Obviously, since this is the game's first true enemy, Specimen 2 isn't especially dangerous or difficult to avoid. You can easily outrun it as long as you keep moving. However, it is possible to take a wrong turn in certain rooms and hit a dead end, which will give Specimen 2 ample time to catch up and attack you. Thankfully, its attacks only take about a third of your health, and your health will automatically regenerate over time, assuming you are able to avoid taking further damage for long enough. Once you make it through enough rooms, your current pursuer will stop chasing you, and you will be safe for the time being. In fact, for a surprising percentage of the game, you won't be getting chased by anything and can explore the mansion at your leisure. This is a problem because, as I said earlier, there is a lot of reused rooms in Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, and going through the same exact rooms over and over again without anything exciting to break up the monotony can get extremely tiresome after a while. That doesn't mean that you won't occasionally stumble across an interesting area here or there. For example, every now and again, you'll find these little arcade rooms that contain little mini games you can play. One of these games is called Mall of the Spook. In this game, you play as Spooky, armed with a knife, and you have to stab as many innocent civilians as possible before time runs out. Now, why Lag Studios decided to design a minigame based off my own life, I couldn't tell you, but I can't lie, this shit is kind of addictive. It's also kind of addictive in the game as well. So anyways, the other minigame is called Mr. Spook, which is basically a Pac-Man clone. Yeah, not a huge amount of replay value with this one. I also like that when you try to enter your name into the arcade leaderboards, this happens. So it was probably around room 100 that I started to get a bit cocky and full of myself, thinking that this game was going to be a piece of piss and that knocking it through at me could possibly lead to a game over. I was quickly proven quite incorrect with that thinking. You see, if there's one thing Spooky's Mansion loves to do, it's fuck with the player. You might think you've got the whole game figured out, only for something to hit you from completely out of left field. For example, once I got to room 103, instead of simply taking this door right next to me, I decided that I wanted to explore this room a bit more. So I decided to start walking down this long hallway and shit got weird. You probably won't die a huge amount while playing Spooky's Mansion, but the punishment for death can be quite severe, with a game over sending you back to your last save point, which could be a couple of dozen rooms back. But like I said, as long as you keep your wits about you and take the time to actually learn how each specimen operates, death should be a rarity. The next specimen has a cool build-up, with you exploring a lab and reading foreboding documents left by scientists working in the area. Unfortunately, once you come face to face with the creature itself, it's kind of a letdown. It's a weird spider-like creature, which is very easy to run away from. In fact, unless you actually slow down and stop running, you are unlikely to even catch a glimpse of the creature. Once I managed to lose the beast, I found this room with a huge computer. Accessing this computer allows you to look up a database of all the specimens currently found in Spooky's Mansion. Looking up these documents could be considered a spoiler, as it does show you what future specimens will look like. but it also gives you vital clues as to how to survive against them, so I would recommend using these computers whenever you find them. So it was at this point that I started to find the game to be a little repetitive. The rooms were constantly repeating, and while the monsters were initially creepy, once I figured out that all you had to do to avoid them was run away, they quickly lost their scare factor. That was until I met Specimen 5. So at around room 210, I found myself in a location that will seem instantly familiar to any fan of the Silent Hill series, which should be all of you, by the way. The developers managed to nail the look and feel of a typical Silent Hill environment, down to the rusted walls, metal grates, and fucking locked doors as far as the eye can see. Even the atmospheric music sounds like it came straight from the brain of Akira Yamaoka. It was also at this point in the game where I realised Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion might be one of the most terrifying games I've ever played. This is Specimen 5. Its design is obviously very similar to an enemy you'd find in a Silent Hill game, most notably the nurses. Specimen 5 is slow but deadly.
Not to mention, much sexier than you.
Specimen 5 also has one particularly nasty trick up its sleeve that nearly caused me to have a goddamn heart attack the first time it happened. It can fuck with the environment and cause the walls to exhibit all kinds of visual effects that can cause the player to become disoriented, which can easily lead to them accidentally running the wrong way, right into Specimen 5's blade. I know it doesn't look like it here, but I was practically hyperventilating while playing this section. It also doesn't help that whenever the walls start to change, doors are hidden from view, which means you need to start feeling around for the exit. And God help you if you accidentally go the wrong way and hit a locked door. Specimen 5 can kill you in only 2 attacks, so you need to put as much distance from yourself and it as possible. As terrifying as I found this particular sequence, it was also exhilarating to play, and actually had me excited to see what the rest of the game would throw at me. Every few 100 rooms, you will meet up with Spooky, who will congratulate you on your progress in the most sarcastic way imaginable.
So, you made it this far. That's great. I shall grant you a gift for your progress. So just keep going.
Spooky is great, I love her. As I don't want to spoil the entirety of the game in this video, I will quickly highlight a few of my favourite specimens in the game, while endeavouring not to spoil any late game surprises. The Merchant has one of the most unnerving intro sequences of any specimen in the game. You find yourself in a creepy temple, and while exploring, you come across these letters that detail the Merchant's incredibly disturbing backstory. Like, for real, this shit sent shivers up my spine. Then, once you actually come face to face with the Merchant, it's the creepiest fucking shit ever. He just stands there, smiling and not saying anything. I mean, to be fair, this is how I behave when I'm around most women, which is why I'm banned from most female clothing stores. But still, it was at this point that I began to get extremely creeped out, and began running for the exit. The Merchant is actually one of the few enemies in the game that can catch up to you instantly, which means running away isn't always the best course of action. It's better to actually face the Merchant head on. This will stop him teleporting for a limited amount of time, and will give you a chance to put some distance between yourself and him. I actually died quite a few times from the Merchant, because I figured simply running away would always be the best course of action for most enemies in the game. It was refreshing to actually have to stop and learn an enemy's behaviour and attack patterns for once. Also, the death cutscene that plays when the Merchant kills you is the stuff of nightmares. Specimen 10, aka Parasite, is one of my favourite specimens in the game, mainly because it reminds me of something you'd see from an 80s sci-fi horror film, like The Thing. I love the concept behind this specimen. Basically, as long as you keep your cool and don't run too far ahead of the parasite, you should be perfectly safe. But if you freak out and run away as fast as possible, this happens. Ugh!
They're still sexier than you are.
This specimen requires you to keep your cool in order to survive, which makes a refreshing change from just running away from everything as quickly as possible. One of the final specimens you will encounter in the game is Specimen 13, aka Mermaid. For such a late game monster, it's disappointing that the mermaid is such a derivative enemy, with her clearly being heavily inspired by the water monster from Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Basically, as long as you are standing on a crate, you are safe from the mermaid, which makes it almost impossible to die from her, because even if you lose health from one of her attacks, you can simply stand on a crate until your health fully regenerates. While the mermaid is invisible, you can still make out her position by observing any splashes in the water. The mermaid is not one of my favourite specimens in the game, but I still wanted to highlight her, as she serves as a very disappointing final challenge before you take on the last boss. So that is Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Honestly, I didn't intend to talk at length about this game, because it's quite old and there are far better videos out there that cover this game in greater depth than I ever could. But what can I say, I fucking love this game, and I wanted my review of it to be a labour of love. While far from perfect, the fact that a game as enjoyable and terrifying as this is available on Steam completely free is mind-boggling to me. However, if you would like to pay the developers of Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion actual money, they did end up remaking the game a few years later. It's a fantastic upgrade and well worth the money. In fact, I'm going to review it right now. I didn't expect much going into Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, but I ended up getting about 8 hours of the most fun I've ever had with a survival horror game. It goes without saying, but you need to check out this game if you have a PC. It will literally run on a toaster, so there is no excuse for you not to give it a go. It truly blew me away. Well, that wasn't quite as wholesome as I was led to believe. Still, shows how important it is to take care of your mental health. Oh, I actually know a game that's all about
shit fucking transition.
Yeah, I know. Silent Hill: The Short Message is a free survival horror game, I guess? Released in January of this year, and at time of writing is still exclusive to the PlayStation 5. The Short Message is notable for being the first Silent Hill game in nearly 2 decades to be developed primarily by a Japanese development team. The Short Message tackles themes such as bullying and suicide, but unlike earlier Silent Hill games, it tackles these themes with all the subtlety of a fucking sledgehammer to the face. Silent Hill: The Short Message was not received particularly well by critics, which is surprising given its price tag of absolutely nothing. When your game is completely free and it's still sitting at a 53 on Metacritic, that's when you know you've truly fucked up. Critics did praise the game's visuals and atmosphere, which are admittedly fantastic, but had serious issues with the game's tackling of serious subject matter and its frustrating chase sequences. The Short Message would go on to be downloaded 2 million times, which is a bit eye-opening. If only 2 million people could be fucked downloading your free game, it doesn't say much for the potential sales success for the upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake, does it? I have mixed feelings about The Short Message. On one hand, I love the setting, the design of the game's main antagonist, Sakura Head, and the predictably incredible soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka. But on the other hand, I hate how much The Short Message squanders its interesting premise by having the most insufferable imaginable for its main protagonist.
I lost followers again. You don't seem very likable.
As well as having some of the worst written dialogue I've heard in a game in years. However, I still enjoyed the experience for the most part, and would recommend anyone with even a passing interest in the Silent Hill franchise to at least give the game a try. But let me explain why I feel that way. Upon starting up The Short Message for the first time, you are greeted with a screen warning players of some of the themes that will be touched upon in the game, as well as a number that people can call if they themselves have been going through a difficult time. I appreciate the sentiment the developers were going for here, but there are 2 issues I have with this screen. One is that these numbers are for people living in the US, They are fuck all use to people living in Europe, or any other part of the world for that matter. Like, could Konami not have updated the numbers based on which region of the world the game was downloaded from? Typical Konami, even when they are trying to help, they still manage to fuck everything up. My second issue is that this screen appears multiple times throughout the game, completely destroying any subtlety the story may have been going for. On top of that, it's just patronising to the player. It's like the developers are going, hey, this is pretty intense, right? You remember that number we gave you earlier, right? Like, as a person who has had severe depression at multiple points in his life, let me tell you that there is nothing more fucking annoying than someone constantly bombarding you with advice on what you should do with your life. It makes a person feel like their thoughts or feelings aren't valid. So Konami, if by some miracle you see this video, please cut back on this shit for the Silent Hill 2 remake, okay? Anyways, upon getting to the main menu, I was pleasantly surprised. This title screen actually feels like it had some effort poured into it, and Akira Yamaoka's beautiful background music had me almost feeling something akin to excitement to start this brand new installment in one of my favourite survival horror series. The short message begins with our protagonist, a teenage girl named Anita, arriving at a memorial site. It appears that some girl took her own life by leaping from the top of an abandoned apartment complex. Suddenly, the game cuts and Anita somehow awakens inside the building itself, and this is where control is handed to the player. For all its faults, the short message does make a very strong first impression. The game's setting is moody and atmospheric. The building is also eerily quiet, which can be quite unnerving at times. I was feeling very positive about the game at this point. Then this happened.
I'm trapped. I've always been trapped.
Oh no. You see, one of my main issues that I have with the short message is that whenever the game manages to create an effectively creepy atmosphere, that tension is immediately destroyed by Anita coming out with some dumb shit. Every time a clever piece of environmental storytelling occurs, Anita needs to spell out exactly what the developers are trying to say.
Antidepressants. I've taken enough medication.
I understand that the short message was created to appeal more to a teenage demographic, but as stupid as many teenagers can be, they're not this fucking stupid. I played Silent Hill 2 and 3 as a teenager and had absolutely no issue understanding its themes. It honestly just comes across as patronising, but more importantly, it destroys the game's creepy atmosphere most of the time. Anyways, as Anita continues to explore the building, she finds some graffiti art plastered on some of the walls. This art was created by Anita's friend Maya, and every time you find a piece of her art, a live action cutscene plays, giving some insight into Anita and Maya's relationship. These are, shit, but it's how much of the game's plot is told to the player. What's weird is that these cutscenes were done with Japanese actors, which is fine. Silent Hill is a Japanese series after all, but the lip syncing is done terribly and can be very distracting. It's also strange that previous Silent Hill games used American actors for cutscenes and any mocap, but here they decided to stick to a primarily Japanese cast, despite the game being set in Germany. I'm also pretty sure that every other Silent Hill game had its dialogue recorded in English first, but I could be wrong about that. Regardless, we don't learn a huge amount about Maya from these cutscenes, certainly not enough for me to care about her, which is a shame, because with better writing, Maya's fate could have felt a lot more tragic and heartbreaking. It's a shame that the short message has to shoot itself in the foot so often, because when the game does manage to shut the fuck up every now and then, it can be fantastically creepy. As mentioned earlier, Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack is unsurprisingly the highlight of the entire game. Some tracks are absolutely fantastic and had me feeling on edge for their entire duration. In fact, there are moments in the short message where the game can be downright unsettling.
What the fuck am I supposed to find? Find what in a place like this?
One moment towards the end is incredibly disturbing and is told almost entirely without words. These moments truly show what the short message could have been capable of if the developers weren't so desperate to spoon-feed everything to the player. There is one moment early on where you find an article on the negative impact social media is having on young people today. And yeah, sure, that's definitely something that is happening right now. But the game doesn't pose any solution to this issue. It has nothing to say about any of the themes it tries to tackle, in fact. It's like the writers simply thought to themselves, that gosh darn social media, am I right? And then shrugged their shoulders and called it a day. I appreciate a game trying to tackle difficult topics like bullying, but if your product has nothing meaningful to say about the topic, you kinda have to start wondering why it even exists in the first place.
I bought one of those anti-bullying charity wristbands the other day. I say bought, I stole it off a fat ginger kid.
The worst scene in the game by far, however, is when Anita sees how many followers Maya has, and how few she has.
Did you post this too? Even more followers. I lost followers again. Some new followers here. I need to upload stuff like this to get as many likes as Maya.
This scene paints Anita as the pettiest, most shallow person on Earth and makes it almost impossible to empathize with her for the rest of the game. I don't even think it needs to be said at this point, but the developers clearly have no clue about how complex we humans really are, and decides that the only thing we really need to be happy are followers and views. That will fix all our problems. I'm sure there are people out there with hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram who are more miserable than people with less than a dozen. I mean, I only have 2,300 subscribers? You think I'm jealous of the people who have millions? Of course not. In reality, people need to feel like they belong. They need to feel accepted, and to also accept themselves exactly as they are. All the followers in the world could never fix a person who fundamentally does not like themselves as they are. So yeah, overall, despite having some good ideas, the short messages story is a complete failure. Which is a shame, because it's not like the game has a huge amount to offer outside of it. You spend most of the game exploring empty hallways and not really doing much else. There's a simplistic puzzle about halfway through the game that took me all of 30 seconds to solve, and there isn't any resource management or combat in the game to speak of. Though of course, just because there isn't any combat in the short message, doesn't mean that you are never in danger. At sporadic points throughout the game, you will come face to face with a creature called Sakura Head. Masahiro Ito returns to design the game's main monster, and as always, he delivers in spades. The guy certainly hasn't lost his touch. A creature like this covered in cherry blossoms really should not come across as scary or intimidating, but what can I say, this guy is a master of his craft. If you don't know who Masahiro Ito is, well, he's the guy who designed Pyramid Head. You know Pyramid Head, right? That iconic monster who first appeared in Silent Hill 2 and was in no way pivotal to that game's story and themes, thus allowing him to appear in future Silent Hill games. Yeah, that guy. Masahiro Ito is a legend, and you should absolutely follow him on Twitter. Anyways, Sakura Head, or X, or whatever the fuck it's called. Sakura Head will appear during a handful of chase sequences throughout the game. Most of these sequences are fairly straightforward, and should pose little challenge to the player. That said, they are enjoyable when they appear, and instill some much needed tension into the game. However, the final chase sequence can go fuck itself. It's a drawn out encounter that requires the player to run around a confusing maze looking for pages of a diary, akin to something you'd see in a Slender Man game. It's a terrible section and turned what could have been a terrifying final encounter with Sakura Head into one of the most frustrating chase sequences I have ever experienced in a horror game. So that is the short message. It's a fucking mess basically. It's frustrating too because I can really see that the developers poured effort into this project and wanted to create something special, but its story and characters are woefully mishandled and its gameplay is incredibly repetitive most of the time. However, the game still has its moments, few though they may be, and as such, I'd still recommend taking the 2 or so hours it takes to complete this free experience, if you are in any way a fan of the series.